Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is part 2 of Riot City. Yeah! All right, sit back, relax, and enjoy the incredibly strange tale of Bobby Dubs. Have fun, guys. All right, so in preparing the Rifleman episode, I came across a ton of stuff that I wanted to share, but I didn't want to bog that episode down or make it too long, right? So to say that the Baltimore riot of 1861 was an event filled with high strangeness from beginning to end would be a tremendous understatement, right? There's just too many things to cover, right? It would be a series, right? But there are some other things about this event that I do want to share. So in this episode, I want to take a closer look at some of the injuries and or deaths that I thought were especially curious. And so first up is the gunshot wound suffered by one William Reed. Now, this name should sound familiar to longtime viewers because it's a name he shares with Mr. Emily Reed née McKim. And so per the mainstream narrative, right, there's just no way that they're the same person, right? But the name definitely throws up flags for me, especially because the Sun brings him up twice. Very early on in their reporting in Saturday morning's edition, they dropped this brief but detailed mention. So they say that at Light Street Wharf, a boy named William Reed, a hand on board the oyster sloop Wild Pigeon, I love that name, of York County, Virginia, York, of course, right? He received a ball through the abdomen and was dying, at last accounts, in the hold of the schooner. And so like everybody else on the dock that day, he's taking in the action on Pratt Street, and he takes a stray musket ball to the gut, right, which sucks. Right? But how do these details about the schooner and him dying in the hold make it to the Sun? Because potentially this could be far away from the action. How close to Pratt Street was he? Did there just happen to be a reporter there on hand to follow young William Reed from Pratt Street to the dock to the hold? Or did another member of the crew risk their own neck to relay this information to the Sun, right? I mean, most of the other injuries and deaths reported in the Sun that day come from either police stations or dry goods shopkeepers who are refuge for all the injured and dying across Baltimore that day. You know, what kind of rapport did the crew of the Wild Pigeon have with the city of Baltimore that this injury would get reported the way that it did? Right? It's just very curious to me compared to everything else that was kind of happening. And again, the name, just how coincidental is his name, all things considered, because the Sun, as I said, just won't let him go, bringing him up again when talking about the wounded. They remind us of his wound, which has now moved down to the groin. Ouch, right? But still fatal. He's going to die, right? And so even this second mention really just kind of has me just thinking, okay, fool me once, fool me twice. But then later on, when I was reading through the Monday Sun, it turns out Oyster Schooner Boy William Reed's wound was not so fatal after all, right? Because his name does not appear in the list of citizens killed that day. In fact, on Monday, he's been downgraded to slightly wounded. How do you go from fatally to slightly wounded in a few days unless the initial reporting was greatly exaggerated, right? Now, why would they do a thing like that? Or even better, is this even the same William Reed, right? Because they changed the spelling from Reed, R-E-E-D, to Reed, R-E-A-D. How's that, right? Did the slightly injured William Reed, after reading the account of his fatal wounding in Saturday's Sun, send a letter to the editors letting them know that it was just a flesh wound, right? And that they spelled his name wrong. And this isn't the first time we've come across the R-E-E-D, R-E-A-D confusion. Right? Remember, there were two Mrs. Reeds present at Mrs. Jarley's waxworks in 1871. Our beloved High Priestess Emily Reed née McKim and her covenly predecessor Sophia Reed née Howard. The two women in control of the secret Diana cult, running the show out of Baltimore for the entire 19th century. So seeing this name confusion again is telling my fat senses that there's more to this story than meets the eye, right? But I just have no idea what it could be. And speaking of stories that betray the senses, the other injury I'd like to talk about is the mysterious case of Robert W. Davis, Esquire, right? And this injury is truly fatal. And he was allegedly killed at the hands of Northern troops. And so maybe nobody batted an eye at this story in 1861, but today it sticks out like a sore thumb. And so let's jump right in, right? So after telling us that he was killed at the hands of Northern troops, right, the Sun wants us to know that his death has created an intense feeling in the community. More intense than the riot and all the other deaths and injuries happening all over the place, right? But this intensity was evidenced especially among the merchants, of which class he was an honored member. And I like that the Sun considers the merchants a class of their own, and that Robert W. Davis, Esquire, was an honored member. It makes me wonder what the hierarchy of the merchant class looked like, right? Because the Sun sure does love themselves some Robert W. Davis, Esquire, right? They recount the story of his death with great aplomb. He even gets his own subheading. And look at the amount of column space they dedicate to him. This is a 4 full minutes of reading time, right? Hours of work for some poor typesetter. So they tell us that he goes down to the railroad with the multitude, right? Of course, because everybody in town wants to check out the riot, right? And when shot, he was standing apart with some gentleman on an elevation. A grassy knoll, anyone, right? Because I talk about these grassy elevations in one of my lockdown walkabout videos. This is one of the things that drives me nuts about Baltimore. Okay, there's the Hilton, come across Pratt Street here, and then there's a mound of earth with these trees on it. I've been here a while. These are not, like, new trees. So when did they make this mound? And what purpose is it? Right. Anyway, this elevation, right, it was located between the Distillery and Redley Street on the Spring Garden side. Right, so the Sun gives us a location. But Natch, I couldn't find any of these places on either the 1851 or 1860 city plans, right? But undaunted, I did find an article about the riot that states that Robert W. Davis, Esquire, heretofore Bobby Dubs, right, he was killed on the Spring Garden side of Camden Station, which the historical marker database says was here. Right, so now that we know where he was, right, the Sun tells us that he took a mini musket ball in his left side. Right, he reeled for a moment or two, fell, and died without uttering a word. Right, though he breathed several times after policemen Pumphrey, Creamer, Butler, and Hawkins reached him. And how are there 4 cops free enough during all the brick throwing and musket fire chaos happening all around them to tend to one man? It is just insanity. I'd also love to know whose eyewitness testimony to this shooting is the Sun relating here. Right, one of these cops? One of Bobby Dub's gentleman companions? A bystander? Or the reporter's own, right? Like so many of the events within the riot, this aspect is unclear, right? Who's telling what to whom? But continuing, a musket ball also penetrated the back of his coat, but not his back, right? Are they trying to say that he was shot at twice and one of the bullets missed him, but not his coat? How is that? Right? Maybe when he was reeling and falling, it went through his coat. How do they know he just didn't have a hole in his coat? It's 1861. People had holes in their coats, right? Regardless, it's reported that 2 or 3 more shots were fired after he fell from the rear cars, presumably as the train was pulling away. But thankfully, amid the turmoil, there was a vehicle handy to convey his body to the Southern Police Station. And it's here the story goes off the rails, no pun intended. Once his body arrives at the station about 3 o'clock, Justice Showacre appears, apparently from out of nowhere, parting the bustling action like Moses in the Red Sea. Right? And he summons a jury of inquest comprised of 12 men, one Dr. McHugh, whom I'm sure was in no way related to the McKims, right, and himself. So that's 14 total people involved in this thing. Right? Are you kidding me? Right? Did none of these men have anything better to do than deliberate over the cause of Bobby Dub's demise? Right? There were at least 6 witnesses to this thing. Right? The 4 cops and the 2 people standing with him, who we later learn were Thomas W. Hall Jr., not to be confused with his father, and Leslie Buckner of the firm Buckner, Shipley and Company. Right? Why is where these people work such an important detail in everything, right? But anyway, Dr. McHugh examines the body as required by law, right? And I think this is great because I can't really recall any other mention of this law with all the other dead people in this story. And so after his examination, he adjourns the jury to 9 o'clock the next morning. Why? What for? And it turns out this was all just to determine that he was killed by a Union gun. I mean, like, this is crazy. And again, who reported on all of this? Who identified all of these people? It's after 3 p.m., right? The clock is rapidly ticking towards deadline. This is hours of work in typesetting for some poor schlub, right? And the story just gets better, right? They lay out his corpse in the station dressed in his bloody death clothes. And the Sun lets us know that he had one kid glove on and the other was partly drawn. What does this even mean, right? That he had tiny hands, right? I don't understand this at all, right? It reeks of Masonic messaging or something to me, right? They deliberately staged his body this way, is how I see it. So continuing, a great curiosity was evinced by the citizens to view the body. Why? There were bodies piling up all over the streets of Baltimore that day. What was so interesting or important about seeing Bobby Dub's body? Right? This makes me think there was a carnival barker standing in front of the Southern Police Station that day. Come one, come all, see the immortal remains of esteemed merchant Robert W. Davis, Esquire, and his tiny hands. For 1 hour only, right? Because at 4 o'clock, they box him up in a coffin and convey him to his residence at the corner of Saratoga and Liberty Street, where I guess his grieving widow had already arranged for his funeral, only a few hours after his death. How kind of her. None of this feels right? Who was Robert W. Davis, Esquire, really, that he receives such priority treatment, right? The Sun does provide a few tantalizing clues that tickle the old fat senses, right? He was an Irishman by birth, right? He marries a Virginian, lucky him. And he has a brother in the British Army, and that he was so popular that immediately upon the announcement of his death, many of the wholesale dry goods stores of the city were closed in respect to his memory and in testimony of his worth. Right? So not because of the rioting and bloodshed. Intelligence and great popularity in mercantile circles. Apparently so. How is a shop supposed to stay open in the wake of Bobby Dub's death? Maybe the most important clue the Sun gives us to how important Robert W. Davis, Esquire truly was comes in the form of his address, right? The corner of Saratoga and Liberty Streets, which is here, right in the heart of Baltimore. It's an address Bobby Dub shares with the rectory of St. Paul's Church, which is on the same corner, and whose property I brazenly trespassed on during the lockdown. Okay, so forgive me my trespasses, as I forgive those who trespass against me. But I am now on the property of St. Paul's Rectory. All right, I hopped the fence. It was locked. So I'm thinking maybe his address has something to do with why he gets so much play in the Sun. I don't know. Right? This could just be my apophenia running wild. The only thing I do know is that this whole story stinks and may be a complete fabrication to stir up sympathy for Baltimore businessmen and support for Baltimore's secession efforts. And what tips me off to this idea is the absolutely stunning contradiction the Sun makes regarding Bobby Dub's death within its own article. Remember, Bobby Dubs gets shot, reels, falls, then dies without uttering a word. Or does he? Later in the same article, they report that Bobby Dub's companion, Thomas W. Hall, leaned on the deceased's shoulder and asked, "Are you hurt?" To which Davis replies, "Yes, I am killed." How does this jive with dying without uttering a word? Right? It doesn't. And even better, it's a line paraphrased right out of Shakespeare. Right? The bard uses it at least twice. Once in Romeo and Juliet, in Act 5, Scene 3, when Romeo kills Paris in front of Juliet's tomb. They're fighting and Romeo stabs Paris, who cries out, "Oh, I am slain." And he uses the same line in Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 4, when Hamlet mistakes his boy Polonius for an enemy hiding behind a curtain. He says, "How now, a rat?" and stabs his blade through the curtain into Polonius, who falls out saying the same 4 words, "Oh, I am slain." And so much like Hamlet, I smell a rat. Methinks whomever crafted the story of the death of Robert W. Davis, Esquire, doth love himself some Shakespeare. And I wonder which one Robert W. Davis, Esquire was. Was he Polonius? Or was he Paris? And all of this adds a little more fuel to the idea that the Civil War could have been a completely staged or orchestrated event to cover up something. Whether it's your garden variety political and financial malfeasance has the playmakers of the day redefining what America is or should be, right? Or stretching it out that they were covering up a post-mudflood recovery, reconstruction, and repopulation effort, like Mud City prefers, right? But this staging gets more traction here. Right, because you know who loved himself some Shakespeare? John Pierpont. That's who. The Big Chipper's granddad. Founding member of that exclusive literary society, the Delphian Club, of which William Winder was a non-founding member. William Winder, you may recall, was responsible for the in no way scripted or set up sacking of Washington, D.C. Could Pierpont and Winder have been working on an early draft of the Civil War in the 1820s, possibly making the strange tale of Bobby Dubs a remnant of such a draft? Right? Remember, Shakespeare was at the inaugural Delphian Club meeting, watching from on high. Right? So I'd say it's possible, depending on how far ahead you need to plan these things, right? I mean, as with good plans, they need drafting in stages, right? They may need 30 years, right? How long did events like these take to plan? We'll never truly know. And to get all Charlie with it, we can further connect this idea to Baltimore through the Poe Chronicles and the Poe family's connection to the Manners family, Roger Manners being Mud City's choice for Shakespeare's true identity. Perhaps tying the crafting of the Civil War to, where else? Sherwood Forest, right? So, because let's not forget the Poe family ties to Gettysburg through the Manor of Mask, right? It's just unbelievable. It is just unbelievable how the possible scripting of the Civil War can be played out this way. And so to close this one out with a cherry that gives the scripted Civil War one more boost, according to The Sun, the source for the events of the Baltimore Riot of 1861, 2 or 3 more shots were fired after Bobby Dubs was shot and fell. Yet, according to the modern gatekeepers at the Historical Markers database, it was the final shot from the train that felled the intrepid Robert W. Davis, Esquire, as it pulled away, giving him a more poetic and, dare I say, Shakespearean bow, right? And so more evidence that they keep messing with the story, right? Leading me to believe that, at the very least, the story of the death of Robert W. Davis, Esquire is a... I also love the idea that Bobby Dubs here was killed by an angry wife who hired the firm of Thomas Hall and Leslie Shipley to take care of this little problem weekend at Bernie style down at the Baltimore Riot of 1861. All right, guys, that's what I have for this one. I have one more to go with this little trilogy of mine, right? And so remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers.